On April 23, 2023, a large Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy or Plan Coast Guard ship cut off a much smaller Philippines Coast Guard ship filled with journalists and photographers in an area of the South China Sea known as the Spratly Islands. This near collision is only the latest effort by China to project power more than 700 miles away from its mainland, in an 80-year-long effort to control all of the disputed area north of an imaginary line called the 9-Dash Line. What is the 9-Dash Line? How does China think it can control a territory so far from its mainland and supersede the territorial claims of numerous other nations? And what benefit does China get from trying to muscle their way into territorial waters of other countries? Where it all began. The origin of the 9-Dash Line, sometimes referred to in China as the cow tongue because of its shape and occasionally expanded into a 10 or 11-dash line, originated in maps drawn up by the Republic of China (ROC) in 1946, following the end of World War II. This map, published in 1947, shows a dashed line encompassing nearly all of the 1.4 million square mile area that runs from China in the north, past Taiwan in the east, down to the Philippines in the southeast, to Indonesia in the south, and Vietnam in the southwest. This large body of water has been called by many names throughout history, usually based on which maritime power held sway at the time. The Vietnamese called it the Champa Sea, or the Sea of Cham, after the maritime kingdom of Champa, nowadays central Vietnam, which flourished there before the 16th century. During the Eastern Han Dynasty, which ruled from 23 to 220 CE, their rulers called the sea Shanghai, which translates to the Distended Sea. More recently, since July 2017, Indonesia has designated the northern reaches of its 200-mile economic exclusion zones, the EEZ in the South China Sea, as the North Natuna Sea. North of the Natuna Islands and adjacent to southern Vietnam's EEZ, overlapping the southern end of the South China Sea. The government of the Philippines currently designates the area that falls within their EEZ as the West Philippine Sea, though that does not encompass the entirety of the sea, only the areas closest to the Philippines. The sea itself contains over 250 islands, atolls, reefs, sandbars, and other low-lying land masses, many of which are naturally underwater at high tide. Some of them are even permanently underwater and only exist as navigation warnings. The inability to colonize them year-round has led to most of them never being permanently inhabited, and thus their ownership has not previously been an issue. These regions include decidedly European-sounding names, since most of the early maps were created by European explorers. They include the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, Pratas Island and the Vereker Banks, the Macclesfield Bank and the Scarborough Shoal. Unassuming names for some of the most contested parts of the world. But why are so many countries fighting over this disputed area? The value of the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a region of tremendous economic and geopolitical importance. 1/3 of the world's maritime shipping passes through it, carrying over $3 trillion in trade each year. Significant oil and natural gas reserves are believed to lie beneath its seabed. It also contains lucrative fisheries, which are crucial for the food security of millions of people in Southeast Asia. The sea has historically been an important trade route between China, Southeast Asia, and continuing westward to India and on to Africa and Europe. The number of wrecked trading ships that lie on the ocean's floor attests to continuous ocean-growing trade dating back centuries. In modern times, the South China Sea is the second most used sea lane in the world, falling only behind the Dover Straits between England and France. In terms of the world annual merchant fleet tonnage, over 50% passes through the Strait of Malacca between the Malay Peninsula to the northeast and the Indonesian island of Sumatra to the southwest, the Sunda Strait between the Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra, and the Lombok Strait between the islands of Bali and Lombok. Over 10 million barrels of crude a day are shipped through the Strait of Malacca, where there are regular reports of piracy but have become much less frequent compared to before the mid-20th century. Notably, China is the world's largest importer of both food products and oil. The country imports more than 70% of its oil and natural gas, amounting to 10.8 million barrels per day. China is also the world's largest agricultural importer, surpassing both the European Union and the United States in 2019, with imports totaling more than $133 billion. The region beneath the South China Sea has verified oil reserves of around 7.7 billion barrels, with an estimate of 28 billion barrels in total. Natural gas reserves are estimated to total around 266 trillion cubic feet. A 2013 report by the U.S. Energy Information Administration raised the total estimated oil reserves to 11 billion barrels. In 2014, China began to drill for oil in waters disputed with Vietnam. The area in question is known as Vanguard Bank, and Vietnam officials claim it lies within their country's 200-mile EEZ. China, however, claims this valuable area as part of its own historic territory, again pointing to the 9-dash line. According to studies made by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources of the Philippines, this body of water holds 1/3 of the entire world's marine biodiversity, thereby making it a very important area for the ecosystem. However, the fish stocks in the area have been significantly depleted, and countries are using fishing bans as a means of asserting their sovereignty claims. How did we arrive at the current EEZ distance of 200 miles? The ability for a country to determine its legal control of the seas began with a 3-mile limit from shore, since that was the furthest distance a cannon could fire, as determined by the Dutch journalist Cornelis van Bankershoek. Beginning in the late 1700s, the distance was extended to 12 nautical miles. The first openly recorded assertion of exclusive jurisdiction beyond the traditional 12-mile territorial limit was made following the end of World War II by the United States in September 1945 after the publication of the Truman Proclamation. This declaration was introduced to protect fisheries and other natural resources close to U.S. shores, but as with the various naming conventions of the South China Sea, it was backed up by the dominant military might of the U.S. Navy. Further clarifications of the U.S. control of their EEZ have been made by later presidents, including a lengthy addendum published during the Reagan presidency in 1983, reasserting U.S. claims to sovereign rights and control over the living and non-living natural resources of the seabed, subsoil, and superadjacent waters beyond the territorial sea, but within 200 nautical miles of the United States coasts, including new rights over all minerals, such as nodules and sulfide deposits in the zone, and deposits of polymetallic sulfides and cobalt manganese crusts in these areas, which could be a major future source of strategic and other minerals important to the U.S. economy and security. Interestingly, the statement mentions that the U.S. will not exert control over migratory fish species like tuna, which they suggest would be better managed by international agreement, nor will they prohibit international scientific studies. Following the Truman Declaration of 1945, the countries of Chile and Peru were the first nations to also claim maritime zones of 200 nautical miles in June and August of 1947, respectively. Both countries view their access to the South Pacific fisheries as vital to their own country's sustainability and have struggled through the years to maintain cordial relations with each other while jealously guarding their own access to the sea. It wasn't until 1982 and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, that the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone was formally adopted by the UN signatory nations. UNCLOS replaced the older freedom of the seas concept, which was initially introduced around the early 17th century. According to this concept, national rights were limited to a specified belt of water extending from a nation's coastlines, usually the previously mentioned 3-mile limit. All waters beyond those limited national boundaries were considered international waters, free to all nations but belonging to none of them, also known as the Mare Liberum principle propounded by Hugo Grotius. Again, this was a decision that benefited a powerful naval country at the time, the Dutch, to go where they pleased and to trade with whomever they liked. In fact, Hugo stated it quite clearly himself, though he did so originally in Latin. My intention is to demonstrate briefly and clearly that the Dutch, that is to say the subjects of the United Netherlands, have the right to sail to the East Indies, as they are now doing, and to engage in trade with the people there. I shall base my argument on the following most specific and unimpeachable axiom of the law of nations, called a primary rule or first principle, the spirit of which is self-evident and immutable, to wit, every nation is free to travel to every other nation and trade with it. This interpretation was more or less satisfactory until nations began waging wars on the high seas. Even then, it was the country with the most powerful navy that usually got its way of interpreting who was free to trade with whom. Napoleon did his best to block trade with Great Britain by any countries that France controlled in 1806 via the continental system, though he did so from the land and not via the sea. Later, Germany tried a more lethal blockade of Great Britain during World War I and II, while the U.S. was more effective in its naval strangulation of Japanese trade in the Pacific from 1943 onward. It was partially due to the consequences of such military obstruction of trade that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted. No longer would any one nation be able to prohibit any other nation from traveling from their country to any other. This openness of the world seas made the modern system of worldwide trade such a success. Also significant in the new convention was the prohibition of roving bands of fishing boats catching fish or whales illegally in another country's protected waters. The emphasis, however, lies with the term illegally, the special problems in the South China Sea. As we noted earlier, the Republic of China, the ROC, attempted what no other nation had ever done. They claimed almost the entirety of the South China Sea, some areas of which are more than 700 miles from its coastline, as its own protected territorial waters. The ROC lost out to the communist government of Mao Zedong in 1949, but seeing what a good thing they had going with the Nine-Dash Line, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, decided they had inherited that same claim. Not much happened over the following 50 or so years. All nations along the South China Sea fished where they could, usually in their own 200-mile EEZ, and often complained about incursions from neighboring countries. But with the European nations involved in wars in Indochina at the time, including France and Vietnam, China wasn't able to prosecute its claims. The United States then exerted its control in the region with its war in Vietnam into 1975. Following the war, the U.S. maintained a naval presence in the region but was willing to step back and allow the local nations to settle their own territorial disputes as long as the rules of free trade and the rights of navigation were followed. There was an early attempt of the PRC to claim ownership of the Spratly Islands as early as 1951, when the U.S. and other World War II allies drafted a Peace and Normalization of Relations Treaty with Japan. Then PRC Foreign Minister Zhao Enlai stated, "The Paracel Archipelago and Spratly Island, as well as the whole Spratly Archipelago, have always been Chinese territory." Though occupied for some time during the War of Aggression unleashed by Japanese imperialism, referring to Japan's invasion of China during World War II, they were taken over by the then Chinese government, the ROC, following Japan's surrender. The Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China declares herewith this inviolable sovereignty of the People's Republic of China over Spratly Island and the Paracel Archipelago will by no means be impaired, irrespective of whether the American-British draft for a peace treaty with Japan should make any stipulations and of the nature of any such stipulations. But the ownership question of these islands, along with much of the rest of the South China Sea, was not specifically settled through the treaty and has remained in dispute ever since. Following the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, the Philippines and Malaysia each began claiming the Spratly Islands as their own. In 1988, the PRC and Vietnam fought with each other near a small area called the Johnson Reef. The PRC had obtained a permit from the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission to build 5 observation posts for the conduction of ocean surveys, and one of the permitted observation posts was planned for the Spratly Islands area. The PRC chose to build one observation center on an area called Fiery Cross Reef, which was isolated from the other islands in the region and was not occupied by any country at the time. When it started to build the observation post in the previously unclaimed Fiery Cross Reef, Vietnam sent some Navy assets to the area to monitor the PRC's progress. The two countries' navies fought a brief and inconclusive battle near Johnson Reef, and after the clash, China continued to occupy the region around Johnson Reef. In 1994, the PRC occupied a new area, ironically enough called Mischief Reef, located around 250 miles from the Philippine coast. The occupation started in the middle of an energy resources race in the Spratlys, where China lacked a presence while the other countries were starting their own oil exploration interests. Mischief Reef marked the first time when the PRC had a military confrontation with the Philippines, an ally of the United States. The occupation and/or control of most parts of the Spratly and Paracel Islands has not changed significantly from the 90s through to the 2000s. The PRC controls all of the features in the Paracels. In the Spratlys, Vietnam controls most features with 29 in total, while the Philippines has control of 8 features, Malaysia has 5, the PRC 5, and the ROC has 1. A Great Wall of Sand. Tensions in the South China Sea began to change for the worse in 2011. In February, the Chinese frigate Dongguan fired 3 shots at Philippine fishing boats near Jackson Atoll, which were well within the Philippines' EEZ. In May, the Vietnamese Binh Minh 02 oil and gas survey ship clashed with 3 Chinese maritime patrol vessels, some 370 miles south of China's Hainan Island. Each side blamed the other for initiating the dispute. Also in 2011, an Indian amphibious assault vessel returning from a friendly visit to Vietnam was interrupted 45 miles from the Vietnamese coast in the disputed South China Sea by a party identifying itself as the PLA Navy and stating that the ship was entering PRC waters and that it must leave before any misunderstandings arose. The following year, 2012, saw an increased militarization of the islands. The ROC started the construction of an antenna tower and an extension of the runway on the occupied Taiping Island in February, allowing the island to accommodate various military aircraft. In response, Vietnam commenced upgrades and land reclamation projects on their occupied Sand Cay and West Reef Islands. In April, the PRC occupied the Scarborough Shoal as a response to the Philippine Navy stopping Chinese fishing boats in the area. Increased tensions have continued for the next 10 years, with disputes and near battles occurring between China, its navy, and elements of the vast semi-governmental fishing fleet as it engaged with and occasionally bullied ships from the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, and especially the U.S. Navy. All of this led up to the PRC's decision to turn portions of the Spratlys, including areas below high tide, into permanent military bases. The artificial islands were created by dredging sand onto reefs, along with bringing in shiploads of rock and other debris, which were then concreted over to make permanent structures. By the time of the 2015 Shangri-La dialogue, over 2,000 acres of new land had been created. By December 2016, it had reached 3,200 acres, and significant weapon systems, including anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems, which were installed. In 2015, U.S. Admiral Harry Harris Jr. described China's continuous construction of artificial islands throughout the disputed area of water as provocative and illegal. What's really drawing a lot of concern in the here and now is the unprecedented land reclamation currently being conducted by China, which is creating a great wall of sand with dredges and bulldozers over the course of months. The PRC originally stated that the various construction efforts were for improving the working and living conditions of people stationed on the islands, and that China is aiming to provide shelter, aid in navigation, weather forecasts, and fishery assistance to ships of various countries passing through the sea. However, many defense analysts see these improvements as blatant and determined efforts to take over the South China Sea militarily. Jane's Information Group, the global open-source intelligence agency, states that it is a methodical, well-planned campaign to create a chain of air and sea-capable fortresses. These military-ready installations include seawalls and deep-water ports, barracks and runways on 3 of the reclaimed islands, including Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef, long enough to accommodate advanced fighter aircraft. Aside from the expected geopolitical tensions that such militarization creates, concerns have been raised about the environmental impact on fragile reef ecosystems through the needless destruction of natural habitats, uncontrolled pollution, and interruption of migration routes. China's rush to build these island bases seems to have overlooked one detail. The subsurface of the islands was never meant to support the weight that China's developments have placed on them. Some of these improvements appear to be sinking into the ocean, a result of both shoddy construction techniques, fast and furious on a global scale, combined with inevitable sea level rise due to climate change, and these efforts are continuing or already complete. If the terraforming no longer makes headlines, The Economist newspaper stated in an article in 2019, it's because it's largely complete. It should be noted that the U.S. Navy has asked for hundreds of millions of dollars for flooding moderation at their Newport News shipyard, as well as for Navy shipyards in Maine, Washington, and Hawaii. These improvements are needed to combat both the estimated sea level rise over the foreseeable future, along with any attendant storm surges that might accompany hurricanes and other storms. Such improvements can be performed with some reliability when the attendant structures are part of the mainland. This is not the case with the 7 or so island-based military posts China has built so far. Any typhoon that roars through the area may create wind and waves strong enough to scrape these bases clean off the shoals they're so delicately perched upon. That would certainly remove the problem for the time being. Does China have the right to create these bases in the first place? The number and potential violence connected with these numerous naval conflicts led to the PRC, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam to agree in 2011 to a set of guidelines which would lead to the implementation of a Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, a DOC, which would hopefully help resolve future disputes. This set of guidelines was based on an earlier agreement created in 2002, also called a DOC, that was drafted between China and the ASEAN member states, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The agreement was described by the PRC's Assistant Foreign Minister Liu Zhenmin as an important milestone document for cooperation among China and ASEAN countries. Some of the early drafts acknowledged aspects such as marine environmental protection, scientific research, safety of navigation and communication, search and rescue, and combating transnational crime, although the significant economic issue of oil and natural gas drilling remained unresolved. But as shown in the timeline we just illustrated, the Chinese plan continued its efforts to harass and interrupt other nations transiting through the areas, as well as restricting or prohibiting their access to economic resources such as fishing. In January 2013, the Philippines filed a notification and statement of claim with the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, based in Hamburg, Germany, seeking determination of whether certain features in the disputed waters were entitled to the legal definition of islands and thus warranted a 200 nautical mile EEZ for fish and mineral resources. In July 2016, the tribunal ruled unanimously in favor of the Philippines and concluded that China had no legal basis for its claim to historic rights in the area within the 9-dash line. The decision was unambiguous in declaring that China had no right to occupy and improve the islands, and thereafter claim a 200-mile exclusion zone around those islands. The decision focused on two main points of dispute. Did China have a historical claim to the area down to the 9-dash line? And did that claim overrule the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? The tribunal dealt with the question of whether China's claims to historic rights within the 9-dash line were in conformity with the UNCLOS. It observed that this area in which China claimed rights to living and non-living resources, like fisheries and petroleum resources, even if it might have been formed in the long historical course, still overlaps areas of the exclusive economic zone or the continental shelf of the Philippines, as well as other countries who didn't initiate the complaint but who stood along with the Philippines to gain from a ruling protecting their own individual EEZs. In the view of the tribunal, UNCLOS establishes a comprehensive maritime zones regime and allocates rights in those areas to the coastal states and other states. In the areas of the EEZ and the CS, the coastal state enjoys exclusive sovereign rights to the exploitation of living and non-living natural resources. Concerning the rights of other states in these areas, the tribunal found that UNCLOS does not permit the preservation of historic rights of any state within the EEZ or the CS of another state. Therefore, after the entry into force of UNCLOS, the historic rights that might have existed for China within the 9-dash line in areas that would otherwise include the EEZ or CS of the Philippines were superseded by the maritime zones regime created by UNCLOS. In short, the ruling decided that any pre-existing historic rights China claimed no longer existed, as they were overruled by the 1982 UNCLOS agreement. Accordingly, the tribunal concluded that China's claims were contrary to UNCLOS and exceeded the geographic limits imposed by it. The Philippines, as well as the other countries bordering the South China Sea, hailed this ruling as a clear win for them. China, however, dismissed the verdict as illegitimate and continued or even increased its harassment of other nations' navies and fishing fleets. Where does Taiwan fit in this puzzle? China's historic claims to the South China Sea are in large part the same claims it makes on the independent Republic of China, now confined to the island of Taiwan. China still claims the island as a breakaway province and has stated in no uncertain terms that Taiwan will eventually be returned to the PRC control, whether voluntarily or militarily. As recently as February 2023, U.S. intelligence officials shared that China's President Xi Jinping has instructed his country's military to be ready by 2027 to invade Taiwan. She stated publicly in October 2021 that no one should underestimate the Chinese people's staunch determination, firm will, and strong ability to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The historical task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. So the rhetoric that Taiwan is a historical entity inseparable from the motherland is the same false logic used to claim the historic rights of ownership of the South China Sea. It should not be overlooked that previous to that 2021 statement, President Xi had earlier warned that foreign forces attempting to bully China over Taiwan's continued independence would be on a collision course with a Great Wall of Steel. He said China's whole country must work together and move forward in solidarity, resolutely smashing any Taiwan independence plots. His description of being on a collision course seems to be exactly what was on display during the April 23, 2023 confrontation between the planned Coast Guard ship and the Philippines boat. China's pressure tactics in the South China Sea are almost identical to its efforts of intimidation surrounding Taiwan, which have witnessed hundreds of intrusions by PLA Navy and air units. Recently, China has even included its best operational carrier, the Type 002 Shandong, in drills that simulated a full naval blockade of Taiwan in April 2023. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, along with its allies Japan, Australia, and Great Britain, have exercised what they call freedom of navigation exercises through all the disputed areas, including the Spratly Islands and the Taiwan Strait. Each and every time they're met with Chinese aircraft or ships and warned away from Chinese territory, and each time the exercises continue, with ships obeying the ruling of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea that such areas are open for free navigation by all parties. If they're done through territorial waters, as with parts of the Philippines or close to Taiwan, such exercises are done with the full permission and probably a lot of gratitude by the host nation. It's clear that China sees Taiwan and the South China Sea as historically its own. They have proved time and again they're willing to bully and intimidate other countries with the plan to force them to back down, and have even stated publicly that they're willing to go to war over their ability to control either or both. So far, no full-on military exchanges have resulted from these tactics, but China is playing a very dangerous game. While most observers believe China will have to initiate aggressive and lethal action before another nation's military will respond, it is entirely possible that some provocation by either side could be interpreted as the opening salvo in an actual war. Bullying and intimidation will only last so long. At some point, those being bullied will push back, and with such large and lethal militaries on both sides of the conflict, the consequences would be tragic. Want to know what would happen if China continues its aggression? Check out I Survived 100 Days of World War III, or click this other video instead.